Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
Next week, it is me and you and Q. It's John Delancey, my special guest, back on the show after a couple of years. Actually, it's been almost 3 years, I think, since he appeared. And what an honor that was to be back to talk about acting and humanism and religion and just kind of whatever else comes to mind. John Delancey next Tuesday. And, of course, my patrons get the show a couple days early and commercial free. Today, we're talking about Islam. It's always interesting when I address Islam on my pages and on my show, because two things usually happen. The first thing is that someone says, well, Christianity's just as bad. The Bible's just as bad as the Quran. Why aren't you talking about Christianity? Why must you talk about Islam? It's strange to hear this. And then the second thing I often hear and see on my pages is, how come you atheists never talk about Islam? And I'm just thinking to myself, what? Have you been through the archive? Have you seen the catalog of shows and podcasts and conversations we've had online? Have you followed the social media pages as we talk about Islamic theocracies and the hijab, the covering of the women, liberation of women from these oppressed societies, the Quran itself and the awful scriptures in the Quran? I mean, people are like oblivious, and I just can't figure it out. I'm like, how obvious can this be? It's the second most popular religion on planet Earth. And from my perspective, it is sourcing and informing the most dangerous religion on planet Earth in 2019. Of course, we're talking about Islam. And of course, as a former Christian fundamentalist, I'm not ignoring Christianity. It just makes me crazy. Anyway, today we are talking about Islam, specifically a film that addresses the Islam question, a film called Islam and the Future of Tolerance. It's directed or co-directed by Jay Shapiro. Jay directed the 2015 documentary called Opposite Field, described as a love letter to the game of baseball from the place you would least expect. And of course, the film we're discussing today, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Juxtaposed in here between segments of our conversation, I have actual movie clips from the film. I think I have 4 or 5 different clips. Some are from the actual movie, and then there are some deleted scenes being provided as bonus content. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and you're going to hear a lot from the movie right here in this broadcast, this conversation with Jay Shapiro. If you'd like to watch the exchange on YouTube, the video link is in the description box of this show. I just finished watching a documentary on Amazon Video. It was like 99 cents. Well worth it. It's called Islam and the Future of Tolerance. It's an interesting exchange, largely centered around Maajid Nawaz and Sam Harris. You can call them adversaries to a degree, but also friends. It's an interesting exchange and a necessary discussion. The co-director of Islam and the Future of Tolerance, Jay Shapiro, joins me here. Jay, it's good to talk to you, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
Is there a future of tolerance? Are we kidding ourselves here? I'd hate to jump right into the deep end, but
let's jump into
come on.
it.
What are your thoughts?
I hope so. Is there a future of tolerance? There has to be. I think there must be, or else we're going to lose the experiment of the Enlightenment when it has been just so tremendously successful when you zoom out and look for it. And I think that's the real fear of the conversation. I love that. Actually, that's a really good question, because I've been trying to, and when talking about this film, I keep insisting, at least for me, it's much more about the subtitle, The Future of Tolerance, than it is about the first word, Islam, which happens to be the thing that these two men clash about. And it happens to be a tremendously useful and also emotionally charged lens to have the conversation about tolerance, just because it's the collision of race and religion and all kinds of things that really set people off. But the question of the film, and the question I think of a lot of these conversations, really is the one you asked: is there a future of tolerance, and what does it look like? And maybe had we been misdefining or ignoring some obvious conversations about the nature of tolerance that 9/11 just happened to expose, which led to this conversation. One of Sam Harris's famous quips and greatest hits little lines, because he's so quotable, is tolerance of intolerance is cowardice. I think the future of tolerance needs a very serious deliberation on, are we talking about tolerating cultures and ideas, or are we talking about refusing to tolerate anti-Enlightenment ideals and values that clash with arguably universal human rights? That demands a whole other conversation about defining what a universal human right is and trying to do that without religion, which is a necessary conversation to have. But if we decide something like it's a universal human right to be able to go to school, and then you find a culture, or it doesn't even need to be a lot, even it could be 10 people who have an idea in their head that women shouldn't be able to go to school, and there's some divine rationalization for it. You're now faced with this, which sounds like a really easy equation to do, of do you tolerate the culture or their right to hold that opinion, or do you refuse to tolerate that and instead champion what you know is a universal human right, that women should be able to go to school? The answer to that question feels incredibly obvious, and it only gets less obvious when you make that cult or that culture ancient and large, and you throw in things like a large percentage of their adherents are of another color from you, or come from an area where you feel some sort of guilt about the way your country has stolen its resources. You throw in all of that stuff, and then the question feels very muddy, but it shouldn't be. It's actually a very easy question to answer in that hypothetical. Politically, it's difficult about how we talk about it, which is, I hope, what the film can address. But why it's maybe intellectually so damn boring is that it's an easy thing to say. Yes, women should be able to go to school, and that's it. But that's the end of that. The moral analysis is done. We can go into it deeper, but I think that's done. But then the political communication of that moral analysis is incredibly dense and complicated.
It's a minefield. It's a minefield.
A tightrope filmed in the film. And that's what I hope the film does. But intellectually, it's easy.
It's an interesting kickoff to the film. It's a segment you have in the trailer where there's, is it a British television show that was in question? What's the name of the show again? Oh,
Intelligence Squared.
Intelligence Squared.
Actually, yeah, it's a U.S. They have a UK version as well, okay. But that one's in the U.S. It's actually, I'm pointing because I'm in New York.
That way, yeah. So
yeah, it's in
essentially, they're discussing the merits of Islam, and Sam Harris is in the audience, and Sam Harris and Maajid Nawaz speak sort of to the camera in your documentary about this exchange that they had over the dinner table afterward. Let me play that clip.
There's an after dinner for the speakers and those VIP guests. So we're there, and I'm enjoying my food. I'm happy it's over, and slightly licking my wounds that we lost the vote. Everyone's taking it in turns to speak, and there's this man who I'd never heard of. I didn't have any idea who he was, actually. Ayan says, I want Sam to have a chance to say something.
Sam, I remember, asked a very pertinent set of questions to Maajid, which I remember thinking, ooh, that's going to hurt.
I was almost certainly into my second vodka tonic, and my tongue had been loosened. And I directed my remarks directly to Maajid. And I said, Maajid, everyone in this room recognizes that you have the hardest job in the world, and we are incredibly grateful that you're doing it. But your job, unfortunately, seems to be to pretend that Islam is a religion of peace, when in fact it's not a religion of peace. And I'm wondering if this pretense is in fact the remedy, in your view, if it's just a matter of pretending long enough and hard enough that jihad, for instance, is just an inner spiritual struggle, whereas it's in fact, at least in part, a doctrine of holy war. Do you feel that if you pretend this enough, you will capture the next generation, and then this will be the solution? This will be what modernizes Islam.
So I found that a particularly offensive question. I remember at the time looking at him really, in no mood to jest. I looked at him straight in the eyes and said, "Are you accusing me of lying?" And everyone suddenly went quiet. And he tried to say something, and I said, "No, are you accusing me of lying?"
I thought maybe he would hit Sam.
It was one way to spoil a dinner.
It's enough that we lost the vote. And I just felt, come on, can't you be happy with the fact you won? Why do you need to rub it in? Why do you need to get me out down here among these people I don't know and admit to something that I genuinely don't believe? And you're trying to embarrass me? What are you trying to do?
Things got threatened to go haywire, and we were rescued by the rest of the room, who just erupted into conversation.
And I didn't know at the time that Sam Harris practices mixed martial arts. He probably would have kicked my ass.
I didn't think that evening that, well, Majid and Sam are likely to holiday together anytime soon. But I could see that since they both think things through, that if they were to ever get together again, it would be interesting.
It's interesting to hear that, because they're both very passionate, very direct speakers. I think, honestly, they're both very good men. And both feel they are arguing the side of right. Mm. And to have that moment where, Ayan said they almost came to blows, she thought, or she was worried that it might go that far. And then to see these guys reunite for this conversation, how many years later, and how did that come to fruition?
Yeah, 4 years later, after that dinner where they sort of just part ways, Sam reached out again, and we tell sort of in his telling of why he reached out again in the film, it's simply because he was frustrated with having what he was considering more and more failed conversations on this particular topic. Just bumping his head into a wall against people who were misunderstanding him, or he was sure they were misunderstanding him, whether intentionally or not. Just, he was hitting a dead end of this particular topic in this conversation, and he was frustrated. Majid also may have been going through a bit of his own process. Keep in mind, that first clash at that dinner and that night Majid was only 2 years removed from being in a prison in Egypt. So he was still, I think, going through some of his own process of sorting things out in his mind and maybe some emotional residue, obviously. So it's just right place, right time. Sam reached out again, just over the internet, I think an email or social media, asking Majid if he would just want to try to broach the subject again. And if we tell, of course, the story of the conversation in the film, but it started. It wasn't overly tense. There was certainly some disagreement, but it was clear, as you mentioned, both men were coming in good faith at that point. And still, it was the same challenge. It was the same question of Sam wondering, is this the strategy? Are we just lying about this thing? I think Majid wanted to push back a little bit of saying, we don't have to lie about it, but our language needs to sharpen about exactly what we mean when we say Islam is a religion of peace or Islam is not a religion of peace. Or I think a line that Majid would use now is, it's kind of a dumb question to ask. Is it a religion of peace or not? It's to a certain degree what we make of it.
Some particularly troubling passages, such as cutting the hand of the thief, the male and female thief cut off their hands, is a passage in the Quran. Well, if I were to say to you in the English language that the hand behind this organization is really the COO, not the CEO. If I said his right hand is X, Y, and Z, you'd immediately understand that I'm talking about the shoulder to lean on, the power, the real power behind the organization. You know here that I'm using the word hand metaphorically. Now, I recognize that this is going to sound, perhaps, in a way, intellectually gymnastical for for some people. But actually, I mean, I would genuinely assert that interpreting any text rests on an understanding of its literal and metaphoric meanings and the words and the context in which they come. And so I make a plea now to those who are critical of religion, as they have the right to be, in particular Islam, that there is, frankly, practically, there is no other way forward apart from allowing Reform Muslims who are seeking to do this work while challenging Islamist theocrats to provide that leadership that resonates within the communities, that is consistent with their historical experience and that resonates with them culturally.
But he's insisting that it's possible to make it something that is not nearly as harmful as a jihadist would tell you. Or
essentially, then it would be what Christianity is today, right? We've distanced ourselves from the more literal, fundamentalist, more violent scriptures, and contemporary Christians now practice a different flavor of Christianity. Is that the argument he's making?
I would say so. Yeah, I'll also just say and put out that, you know, what's nice also about this film and being a director of it is I'm not beholden to either of the men's arguments. I can disagree with Sam and I can disagree with Majid. And so I'm hesitant to speak precisely for Majid's point of view there and his mission there. But I think clearly, actually, I'll answer it a slightly different way. Someone who didn't make the film, but Usama Hassan is the theologian at Quilliam, which is the group that Majid started to work on counter-extremism in the UK. They now have a North American chapter as well. When I interviewed him, I don't know if even this is fair to him either, but I would say, is envious of something like the Reform Judaism movement as an institution, as it's like, you know, it has buildings and it has an established kind of structure, at least in American Jewish society. And while it has intellectual problems, surely you're hard pressed to find Reform Jews blowing up buildings. I think it'd probably be impossible to find, or quite unlikely. Not that they're not perfect people by any means. Usama Hassan, I think the goal for someone like Usama Hassan would be to replicate that institutionalized version of it. Imagine mosques with female imams, something as simple as that. That's something, because of course in Reform Judaism there's female rabbis and they've broken down some of these things. They've tried to incorporate some of the more universal human rights stuff into their religious structure. That if that effort could succeed on a mass scale globally, I think objectively we'd be in a better place.
Conversations of this kind are not about proving that you're right. I don't want to be wrong a moment longer than I need to be. And so if somebody's saying something that makes sense, I want to lose that side of the debate as quickly as possible. In my conversation with Majid, you know, insofar as he was making sense, I wanted to absorb those distinctions and opinions as quickly as I could. For instance, in my first book, The End of Faith, which was my immediate reaction to the events of September 11th, I use phrases now that I no longer tend to use. And while I meant the same thing back then, it's easy to see how I was sowing misunderstanding, both about my own motives and about what I thought was going on in the world. So, for instance, there's a sentence in that book which reads, "We're at war with Islam," full stop. Now, if you read the context in which that sentence appears, I'm still even there differentiating levels of belief. And I'm under no illusions that we're at war with all 1.6 billion Muslims on earth. But at the time, I simply just talked about Islam as an ideology. And the only differentiation I could make is just degrees of adherence. Well, finding new words for these degrees is incredibly useful. So to be able to talk about jihadism versus Islamism versus conservative Islam, as Majid does, is something I now do, and it's extremely useful to be able to do it.
Sam Harris said something interesting in the film. By the way, I'm talking here with Jay Shapiro, who is the director of Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Sam was talking about, and I guess this comes back to those coexist bumper stickers, which I'm not a big fan of. Let's all just get along. Can't we all just agree to disagree and share this planet? I'd like to buy the world a Coke, blah, blah, blah. And Sam's like, well, I think that agreeing to disagree is kind of a cop-out and can be dangerous. Because essentially by checking out of important discussions regarding truth claims, you may be allowing damaging lies to exist. Do you want to weigh in on this? What's your perspective on agreeing to disagree?
Yeah, I'm totally with Sam on that one. I love that moment as well. That whole interview was wonderful. We'll be releasing some more bonus clips from it. Absolutely. I think his specific example he brings up there is, what does it mean to say you agree to disagree about something like gay marriage? These are human lives and freedom at stake. What does it mean to, the example I brought up before, what does it mean to say you agree to disagree about whether girls should be able to go to school? Okay, you could shrug and say that, but if the person across from you disagrees with you and they happen to be in power, well, there's a lot of girls not going to school because you just walked away from that conversation. There's real things at stake about being wrong, especially about moral claims, and they're urgent. They're urgent. We can't just agree to disagree about these things. You have to choose your battles, of course. It's like, should you agree to disagree of like whether The Simpsons is a better show than Family Guy? Maybe less things hang on the balance there. But on a lot of topics, you're very quickly, I think his example is, or his line in the film is, you're very quickly talking about matters of life and death and human freedom. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. These conversations need to be had. And I think as a species, we're charging in, and very quickly, just to give us a little slack. This is all very quick. Like this globalization thing was a blink of an eye. You turn back the clock on even just 50 years, and we lived in a very different universe. We live in an exciting time, you and I and everybody listening to this, because of the questions that we face and the challenges ahead of us. We have an opportunity to really take on a lot of these huge consequential issues. For the first time ever, we have an opportunity to do this. They're just not easy questions of globalization and multiculturalism. We're challenged with, finally, I think, having to really defend and examine our own moral normative claims and have the bravery to defend them, I think, is really what it comes down to, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of people.
Well,
especially
not to interrupt you, Jay, forgive me.
No.
But, again, in the Twitterverse, I mean, your film is wrapped around the idea that two people with divergent points of view come together in a way and sort of hash things out. And they ask a lot of questions, getting clarification. Is this what you mean? Is this, how am I defining it the way you're defining it? Respectfully and yet directly engaging each other one-on-one. Yeah. This hyper-connected world, in a perfect world, we would all be doing this. But instead, it seems like we just want to win. We want to dehumanize. We're freaking out and all cap typing against the avatar. We're name calling the ad hominems. There's a dehumanization of the other or the opponent that's happening in these conversations that seems so amazingly counterproductive. And I try not to despair too much over it. Have you seen it? What do you think?
Yeah, I've definitely seen it. The incentives to do that are really strong and up against us. The incentives to amplify outrage on social media are there. The incentives of the news media to tell you that the sky is falling every day are there to keep you clicking. We're up against our own human psychology, which just unfortunately, if we live in this attention economy, maybe this is what you're getting to, if we live in this attention economy and everybody's fighting over our attention all the time, that's all they want. It's just an unfortunate asymmetry that being angry and outraged channels your attention and brings you into an emotional state that is much closer to the platform than agreement and kumbaya. Just unfortunately, that's the way we live, or that's the psychology that we just have on board because of our evolution, and we have to fight against that somehow. So we're up against it in a major way. But things like this podcast and the energy of this film doing well and these kind of conversations, there's clearly an appetite for people who are this wonderful term going around, the exhausted majority of people must be getting exhausted of just being hammered all the time.
I think you're right. I think there's for lack of a better word, a backlash. Like people are just tired. And so when someone comes out and they're like, hey, let's de-escalate. Let's be friendlier. Let's try to be kinder to each other. I mean, the malcontents are always going to lose their shit and say, why would I be kind to a Nazi? Or they'll find a reason to borrow whatever and jump into that. But I'm seeing a sort of a backlash against the dehumanization of the other and this sort of petty tribalistic thing. It's still hard to talk about Islam. We were talking about the hijab, the no hijab day on my social media pages. Yasmin Muhammad was talking about that, and I had retweeted some stuff, and people immediately descended and said, you're an Islamophobe or you're a man. Why in the world would you care about human rights issues? Is essentially what they're asking. And I'm like, well, because I'm a human being and part of the human condition, and it matters. But Islam just seems to continue to be this sensitive nerve, and if you bring it up in any critical sense, you are the ad hominems just kick in immediately, and that's going to be a tough hurdle to get over.
Yeah, I think we need, as you were talking, I was thinking with the ad hominems and just the temperature that can, especially online, get to where it gets, we all just need to cut each other a break, like this thing's kind of hard. Life is hard and life is complicated, and we need to cut each other a break. Start in good faith that we're all trying our best and really try to understand the other. It's not always true, unfortunately. Some people just don't want to have a conversation. But if we start with just giving each other the benefit of the doubt that life is hard, life is complicated, and we're all trying to figure this thing out, I think we could make a lot of headway more than just starting with who's my enemy, what team are you on. This tribalistic stance is killing us, obviously.
Now, only an American white male Islamophobe would say that, Jay. I'm just saying. So, all right. Did any of your perceptions change?
Actually, wait. Can I like to that? It's an accurate joke, but I do want to. I want to give a little. If I can do this, maybe if people will allow me. If I can give even the benefit of the doubt to people making those accusations.
All right, go, please.
The regressive left and this identity politics, intersectionality kind of like madness that we've all seen. I'll try something here that, gosh, I'm not even sure how to do it. As a white male, I'll try this. As a white male who grew up in a comfortable suburb, and I grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and I happened to be born into a family that was very supportive of my intellectual explorations. I never had God pushed down my throat. I did have a bar mitzvah. I grew up in this Jewish culture, which we could talk about, but I never really felt a strong pressure to conform to any, at least ideological views. I was able to explore. I was lucky enough to have a little money with my family, that I did some traveling that was crucial to my life. All of these things, if you want to call that privileged, be my guest. And I just don't want that to be a slime label. Okay. So if I was able to enjoy the privilege of an intellectual exploration that started when I was young and an education that was pretty decent, that's all an accident of my birth. I didn't choose any of that. I'm lucky to have it. Lucky, I can't take responsibility for it. And what that allowed me to do was maybe go on this intellectual journey, and I can spend time thinking about the universe and reading philosophy and maybe even making some mistakes in my life and not being slammed for them because of other power structures that are in play. All of that is true. But what's hard about the privilege thing is when people, if someone sees someone like me and criticizing something like mandatory hijab wearing as out of my place, or I don't understand it, or whatever it is, that's a very difficult challenge to. It's not an intellectual challenge, as we know, because that's not actually addressing what I'm saying. It's addressing who I am and my privilege of having my position of having the privilege to be able to make a statement like that and think about those kind of things. I don't want to like totally dismiss that challenge that comes my way as some noise that should just be ignored. I think we do have to address it without giving in to the emptiness of the intellectual argument that's coming your way when someone calls you a white male. How dare you criticize the hijab? It's an empty intellectual argument. But I think you have to. I would to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and even that person coming at you, what is like the best possible argument of that or place for that is, I'll give even like an easier example than the Islam stuff. Do I, as a white man living in New York, is it less likely that I'll be harassed by the police, NYPD here, for jaywalking? Probably. That's actually statistically true, that probably I'll be less likely to do that. Does that mean all cops are racist? Clearly not. But that's just a true statement of the situation we live in, and you could come up with all of the reasons why that happens to be the truth of the moment for me. But the answer shouldn't be that I should be arrested for jaywalking. It should be the other, like this revenge of like, fuck your privilege, you should feel what they're feeling. Maybe I should have the awareness of like, oh yeah, I have that privilege, so what do I do with it now? Hopefully, people who can use this word privilege without sort of the ugly connotations that have gotten attached to it now can recognize that privilege and fight for other people to enjoy the same privilege. Rather than, it seems to have gone the other way, if this answers your question, where there's people who don't have the privilege who seem to want to drag everyone down to that level. I don't know if that has any utility. It seems to be a dead end, where it should be, okay, recognize your privilege, whatever that means, and then try to promote more people to get up to it and to enjoy that privilege.
I think in my own life, I think I tweeted this last year at some point. I don't have to be you to learn from you, or to be an advocate for you, or to support you, or to stand by you, to stand with you. I don't have to have lived your life to be able to learn about what you've been through. I mean, I can't see it through your eyes, but I understand the human experience of love and loss, and I can learn and through your experiences become more educated about oppression and how these systems work. And I can stand alongside you, and we can, as members of the human race, try to work together to better things for all. I don't think there's, I think that's a meritorious way of looking at it. It might be a bit idealistic, it might be a bit utopian, but I just like the idea. We are the human race. We are the human condition. Let's start there. We're the human tribe. Can I with your, because I think this is relevant, and I didn't want to Absolutely. I mean, we got plenty of time. Hit me.
I didn't want to bring up this as a random Twitter message, but we were talking about, we just put out this bonus scene from the film with Yasmin talking about the hijab and her experience with the hijab, and I'm a big fan of it. And right now it's getting a lot of attention online, and there's a lot of people liking it and retweeting it, which is awesome. And the little thread of it has become this digital meeting ground for a lot of women, not just in Islam, in other traditions, who are experiencing the same thing and finding each other just digitally. And I think there's a tremendous value and utility to that.
Women in the 70s in Iran were filling the streets, marching against the hijab. Wearing the hijab, I always felt like an imposter. I always felt like who I was on the outside was not who I was on the inside, and I hated it. I didn't think it could get much worse, but yeah, you cover somebody in head to toe in black, and yep, there you go, you found something worse. Wearing that niqab for 5 years, you feel like a ghost. You feel like you're not a human. You feel like you're just walking amongst humans because you're invisible. You can see people, but they can't see you. You don't feel like a human. That's why a lot of everything that I focus on these days is things like My Stealthy Freedom, which are women in Iran that just want to take a picture without a hijab on, It's such a simple thing. But they're risking being fined, being imprisoned, they could be killed. It's just women saying, we're here and we're suffering. Can somebody please notice? When you have the burkini ban happening in France, everybody loses their mind that these French women are going to be told what to wear But when women across the Muslim world are being told what to wear at the risk of imprisonment and torture, silence.
One of the women who responded mentioned that she also covers her hair in the Jewish faith, using Jewish fashion, wigs, hats, whatever. A lot of people don't even know that happens here in Brooklyn. And she writes, like, I resent it every day. I don't know anything about this woman. This is a random Twitter person who appears to be anonymous on Twitter and I think she labeled herself as an agnostic, but secretly. And then she wrote something like and she put choice in quotes, that choice is an illusion in a context where the price of choosing not to wear it or cover your hair for her is just too high to pay. And then she points towards, that she knows her choice as a Jewish woman, I think she's in the UK, is not even as high as, of course, someone like these women in Iran, who a lot of these women are now getting sentenced to jail for taking up a hijab. She's not facing quite that, but she's facing a choice. And then these are just random Twitter conversations that don't really need to be addressed directly, but a few people responded to her in these kind of, to your point, ways that are true, but really not helpful, and lack a degree of the good kind of empathy. Someone said something like, choice is never an illusion, or someone said, like, but you still wear it, kind of thing. This almost snarky, like, well, just take it off, if you know it's wrong, which is maybe intellectually true, but total bullshit and total lack of understanding of the social pressures, the need of a family, the need of a system of support that's around you. It's all you've known. It's not so damn easy to walk away from these religious traditions, even at the moment that you know it's bullshit or you resent that you have to cover your hair. It's not so easy just to take it off, let alone the physical harm that might come your way. Just the social, starting that we're social animals, and that means a lot to us. You can't deny that. And that's what's hinging on this. Another friend of mine, Megan Phelps-Roper, I don't know if you're familiar with her, from the Westboro Baptist Church. She's an incredible woman, and she left the Westboro Baptist Church. These are the people who held up the God hates fags signs and picketed funerals and stuff. Like terrible stuff, right? And she sees kind of the awful flaw in all of that. In fact, Twitter was a huge reason of her understanding how wrong her ideology was and what she was how hateful it was and all that. She's an incredible story, but she's become a good friend of mine. And when you talk to her, what I remember the first time I talked to her, and what was so striking was just, she's like, I miss my family every day, which seems like a really simple thing. These are people who are still deep in it. God hates fags and picketing things. If you look up the Westboro Baptist Church, you've seen her mom and her grandfather, I think, who died recently, but that's her family. And she's like, I miss my family every day. And we should just stop and understand the personal heroism that it takes to walk away from your family and walk away from your life. And walk away from your community, especially if you don't know what you're getting into, or if it's just a wilderness out there, which harkens back to our other conversation about why it's so important in the secular community and the atheist sort of conversation to build a beautiful place that at least feels like something that you're walking towards instead of just walking away.
Well, I mean, I will say, back to the film Islam and the Future of Tolerance, I mean, despite their differences, Maajid Nawaz, Sam Harris, I am convinced they genuinely do care. I mean, they're sincerely caring about people. They want to help other people. And the reason, one of the motivations for what they do, how and why they do it is to help liberate oppressed people and to, have a better world. That, talk about a cliche, but it's really the truth.
What is liberalism if it's no longer the left? And if the left is no longer liberal, how do we understand liberalism? Well, I would suggest that actually a liberal would always, when faced with this challenge of free speech over offense, the liberal would always recognize that free speech must come first, because without free speech, we don't have the right to campaign for the political party that we would support. Without free speech, we don't have the right to advocate for the beliefs that we would support. Without free speech, we don't have the right to hold rulers to account for things we disagree with. Without free speech, we don't have the right to scientific inquiry. And the liberal would always choose, therefore, free speech over offense. You have every right to be offended, but you have no right to insist that I do not offend you.
We live in perpetual choice between conversation and violence. That's really all we have. We have this collaborative project where strangers can magically get together and peacefully build a civil society together. And only conversation makes that possible. Only a willingness to have your beliefs and expectations and desires continually modified by new arguments and new evidence. Only that guarantees that the project of collaboration among strangers is, in fact, open-ended.
You see a real sincerity of purpose in the film. Did any of your perceptions change? Did you learn anything about yourself, or did it change perhaps how you approach the Islam conversations? Before I direct everybody to the film, I mean, any final thoughts on how this experience may have impacted you personally?
It's been very rewarding to see the response so far. I could tell you a bunch of personal anecdotes at this point. I guess it's becoming data with enough anecdotes, but it took about 2 years to make the film from our initial hitting record to when we finally put it out. And in those 2 years, of course, friends and family and other acquaintances would ask what I was working on. I would tell them title and then like a brief description. I got pretty good at describing what I was working on without being too specific. But even as soon as they heard the title, or they would push me to a point of saying, oh, it's about Islam and violence or tolerance or human rights and stuff, they would sort of cringe and make that, like, oh, you're going to touch that one? Like that's pretty scary stuff. And a lot of those people now have seen the film since it's out, and they're coming back to me being like, oh, it's totally fine. Like that film's great. Like there's nothing to worry about. And I was like, yeah, I know. That was the whole point of making it, is that the water's fine. We have to have this conversation. It's not nearly as scary as you were afraid it was going to be. It's not nearly as scary as politicians made you think it was going to be. We have to have this, and the stakes are really, really high. As you were saying, for the freedom and liberation, it's not just like an outward sort of like liberating people who are trapped in something. That's certainly part of it, but also, as we're talking about, defending a system or an ideology or a enlightenment structure that inherently liberates people, defending that so we don't lose that. Because what's maybe more concerning than 9/11, of course, was very scary and obviously lethal for a lot of people. The reaction to an event like that and the possibility of derailing an entire Enlightenment global project because of something like that was very real. I think we're seeing it. I would include the Trump moment as part of this reaction. You don't have to zoom out very far in the history timeline to still put us in the post 9/11 reaction phase. I think we're obviously in it. Globally, we're in it with this pushback against globalization. All of this, I think, is part of a global story that we're all struggling with. But the fear that we might abandon that project, the global Enlightenment project, and let's even throw atheism as part of that rides that coattails or leads it, whichever way we play that chicken and egg question, that is at stake as well. We're not just talking about helping women show their hair in Saudi Arabia. That's a part of it. We're talking about abandoning a global project that we ought not abandon, and maybe we were taking for granted, and the defenders of it are under attack, as we know. The people who are willing to have the courage to defend that project, which doesn't mean, I would argue, to get a little political, doesn't mean becoming a Trumpite, doesn't mean becoming a closed border. I think that's the mistake people are making, because the left has failed to have this honest conversation about this topic, but about generally, as you asked before, the future of tolerance. The left, I don't even know if the left is even a good word here, rational, compassionate people have failed to open the conversation and have an open discourse about what that means, how to protect it, how to promote it, how to export it, how to nurture it and continue to cultivate it here without throwing it away. I think it feels good to build walls. It feels good to close societies. It feels like you're protecting it that way, where I would argue it's suicidal and counter to what got us here in the first place. It takes a lot of care and maintenance to build it. But we're in real danger still of reacting poorly to 9/11, and so poorly that we are going to break something that really shouldn't be broken. We may have reached that point already. I'd like to remain hopeful that we haven't. So there you go. That's what I learned.
Jay Shapiro. If I may, it's a beautiful movie. It's so professionally produced. You're obviously a very skilled storyteller. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass. It's just really well done, but it's also compelling to watch. It's, it moved me. It really did sort of grab me. I would encourage our listeners, support the movie. Check it out. Islam and the Future of Tolerance. That is the website, right? islamandthefutureoftolerance.com. Is that correct?
Yeah. And it's available on iTunes and Amazon and all the VOD stuff right now. It'll be on the streaming stuff later this year. But for now, rent and purchase on all these platforms, share. We also have, to bring it to another thing, we have there's an ability to host screenings through FanForce, which is really cool. We've got a ton of requests for people who want to do screenings. You could have panel discussions and all that kind of stuff as well. So hopefully the film is a tool for conversations out there. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Jay, it's been an honor, my friend. Been a real joy talking to you. I hope our paths cross soon, and all success with the film. All right.
Thank you. Awesome. Take care.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.